Make no mistake, I wanted to die. Despite some effort on my part, life hadn't worked out the way I had hoped. Does it ever? After the loss of my only child, there wasn't much reason to go on. The sun shone not as brightly, and then not at all. The clouds came more often, and then the storm started. After a while, there seemed to be only storms. I ran towards them, towards an end to my pain. But maybe under it all, maybe most of all, I just wanted to see my son again. I didn't believe in God, but I still had too many people that loved me to take the easy way out. I had an old gun my father had given me, yes, but that thought was never appealing. I imagined time passing by and my parents using the spare key I had left them to check on me. They would open the door to find their only son on the floor, a puddle of dried blood surrounding his fractured skull. I couldn't bear that thought. Instead, I found a better way out. The largest hurricane in 10 years was set to manifest a ways off the coast, and I had a sailboat. My son Ethan and I had been working on it together, and I told him that when he turned 18, it was his. I stepped across the dock and set my foot softly on the edge of the boat. Of our boat. The light blue hull of the vessel seemed to call out to me, but it wasn't joyful. That old boat seemed to feel the same pain that had been passing through my blood the past few weeks. Ethan and I had been repainting her together last summer, yet the color now seemed much more faded than it should be. I knew what was missing. I knew who was missing. Its heart had been taken away. It seemed to almost open its eyes for a moment as I stepped onto it completely, as if the boat had been waiting for my son, who was its rightful owner, to return. Instead, its eyes closed back up and it fell back warily into a deep sleep. It wasn't Ethan that had shook it gently from its slumber. It was just an old man. After clearing the bilge of any unseen gas fumes, I warmed the engine. That was good enough, I thought, gently throwing the lines onto shore. I motored slowly into the fog and into the bright shadows of the storm. Having been in the Navy for a few years in my youth, I was used to some chop. This was different. The bow of the boat floated up with each new wave and then crashed down violently back into the sea. Once I was far enough out into the ocean, I sat down at the helm. There would be no farther attempt to navigate. There would be no farther attempt at making it back. Lying down softly, I pressed my feet up against the side of the ship. Staring into the blackness, I watched carefully as the violent clouds seemed to almost swirl around me. I took one last look at the brutal force of the storm before closing my eyes for good. Not much time passed before the old vessel was pushed sideways up against the waves. Then there were a few seconds of peace as the ocean swelled up before me. For a moment, I imagined it was a god deciding whether or not the old vessel and the older man before it were a worthy sacrifice. When my eyes opened next, I was a few yards from the overturned craft. I had worn no life jacket, and I floated on my own as I watched it bob up and down in the waves. There was a sadness that struck my heart then. Watching the boat sink reminded me of holding my son's hand as he had taken his last breath. With that, I gave in, letting my face drop down under the water's surface. Time moved slowly, and as I sank farther down into the water, I watched as the light from the storm became a gentle flicker in the distance. "Dad." They opened back up abruptly. "Help." It was Ethan's voice, I thought, swimming back up to the surface before I passed out completely. My head popped back up into the storm. I regained my breath and called out to him. "Ethan!" A moment passed. "Dad!" It was faint and far off, but I was sure it was him. "Ethan, where are you?" "Here," the voice called out. I swam towards the sound of my son, tapping into an unseen strength I hadn't known was there. I swam for what seemed like hours. Perhaps it was, and though I could hear his voice, there was still no sign of him. "Don't give up, Dad." That was enough to tap into my last reserve of energy, and I pushed through exhaustion and total body failure. It was short-lived though, and after a moment or two, my body stopped functioning completely. My muscles clenched with exhaustion, and I struggled to keep my head above the water. Despite my desperate desire to reach my son, I wouldn't last much longer. I floated on my back for the last time and looked out into the storm. Then I saw him. My son Ethan was at the helm of our boat. It was upright now, and it seemed to almost glide over the waves. My son and the boat seemed to somehow be one, and they bobbed together through the storm as they made their way toward me. "Ethan," I said weakly, a look of both puzzlement and joy falling easily across my face now. "Hang on," he said, continuing to make his way towards me. The boat had almost reached me now, and even though I wanted more than anything to see my son and hold him in my arms, I could feel myself begin to sink. I couldn't control it anymore. Sadness washed over me as my head dropped below the water once more, and I began to sink down into the ocean. Moments passed, and the overwhelming thought of how close I had been to my son flooded my heart. Then I watched as a distant light fought its way through the storm and gently struck my face. My son's hand reached through the darkness and towards mine. "Take my hand, Dad." And I did. I must have passed out then, because I don't remember anything before opening my eyes and seeing 4 large men in orange gear standing over me. A Coast Guard emblem was neatly stitched to each of their jackets. "Breathe slowly. You're okay now," the tallest one said. They helped me sit up, and as they did, I scanned the ocean around us for any sign of my son. "How the hell did you get out here anyway?" I said nothing. Later, I would be told that the voice I had heard was just a hallucination brought on by how close I must have been to death. I would be told that I had imagined my son steering our boat towards me, and that the arm that had reached out to pull me up had been that of one of the 4 men. But I know better. I know that the Coast Guard wasn't the only thing out there that night. I know that my son saved me. 4 days later, a local marina called me at home, explaining that a tow service had seen the old blue boat floating in the middle of nowhere. It was still upright and had been pulled back into harbor. When I drove out to claim it, I surveyed the damage. The once perfect coat of sky blue paint was now chipped and scratched almost entirely on its port side. The mast had fallen off as well during the storm, and the old vessel was cracked and damaged in more places than one. Even so, as I stood in the harbor and stared at the old vessel, I was overtaken by a sudden feeling of comfort. Against all odds, the boat had survived the storm. Maybe I would too. Hey everyone, I just wanted to say thank you for your support and thank you for listening. This one's actually going to be part of my first book that is coming out in September. So if you'd like to read that, I'll leave a link to the pre-order in the description below. But I just want to say thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the story.